Sometimes the richest man in the county can be the poorest soul you'll ever meet. And sometimes the woman scrubbing his floors knows more about real wealth than he'll ever understand. Elwood Brandt owns 10,000 acres of Wyoming ranch land, but at 68, he sits alone at a dinner table built for 12. Clara Mae has worked as his housekeeper for 20 years, humming gospel songs while she cleans, never knowing that those simple melodies are the only joy this big, empty house has ever held. She's broke, he's lonely, and tonight everything changes when he finally tells her the truth. But what happens when a man who has everything falls for a woman who has nothing? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wyoming sun painted the Brandt Ranch in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across 10,000 acres of prime cattle land that stretched toward the distant mountains like a promise of forever. Elwood Brandt stood on his wraparound porch, coffee mug warming his weathered hands, watching the morning light dance across pastures where Black Angus cattle moved like dark brushstrokes against the pale grass. At 68, he cut an imposing figure, broad shoulders that hadn't quite surrendered to time, silver hair that caught the light beneath his worn Stetson, and eyes the color of winter sky that had seen more sunrises than most men could count. The ranch house behind him spoke of old money and older traditions. Built by his grandfather in 1887, the two-story Victorian stood like a monument to prosperity, with its gingerbread trim painted white as Sunday morning and windows that caught and held the light like captured stars. Inside, mahogany floors gleamed beneath Persian rugs that had cost more than most folks made in a year. The dining room held a table carved from a single piece of oak, built to seat 12 but set each morning for one. Elwood took a slow sip of his coffee and listened to the sound that had become the soundtrack of his mornings. Clara Mae's voice drifting through the open kitchen window, humming Amazing Grace while she worked. Her voice carried a sweetness that seemed to settle into the very bones of the house, filling corners that had been empty for too long with something that felt almost like home. Clara Mae Hutchins moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of 2 decades' practice, her hands steady as she prepared breakfast for a man who could afford to hire a dozen cooks but chose to keep just her. At 52, she possessed the kind of understated beauty that improved with Aga silver threading through dark hair she kept pinned back in a practical bun. Laugh lines around brown eyes that had seen their share of sorrow, and hands that told the story of a woman who'd never been afraid of honest work. She wore a simple blue dress beneath a white apron that had been her uniform for 20 years, the fabric soft from countless washings, but still crisp with the dignity she brought to everything she touched. The hymnal that had belonged to her grandmother sat open on the windowsill above the sink, its leather binding worn smooth by generations of faithful hands. The morning light fell across its pages like a blessing as Clara hummed the old songs that had carried her through widowhood, financial struggle, and the quiet loneliness of a woman whose grown son lived 800 miles away in Missouri. She'd been 17 when she married Thomas Hutchins, a good man who'd worked the railroad until his heart gave out 10 years ago. They'd had one son, David, who'd grown up to become a school teacher with 2 children of his own, and a wife who sent Clara photographs, but never invitations to visit. The distance between Wyoming and Missouri might as well have been an ocean for all the money Clara had to cross it. The morning routine played out with clockwork precision. Clara set Elwood's breakfast on the dining room, table scrambled eggs, bacon, biscuits with honey butter, and black coffee served in the china his late wife had chosen 30 years ago. Elwood ate alone while reading cattle reports and weather forecasts. The only sounds, the gentle clink of silverware against porcelain and Clara's humming from the kitchen where she washed dishes and planned the day's cleaning. They spoke little during these morning rituals, their conversation limited to practical matters. Storm coming in from the west, Elwood might say, and Clara would nod, understanding that meant extra firewood needed bringing in. Pastor Williams stopped by yesterday, Clara might mention, and Elwood would grunt his acknowledgement, knowing she'd offered the minister coffee and listened to his concerns about the church roof fund. Yet beneath these simple exchanges lay 20 years of shared mornings, of comfortable silences and small kindnesses. Elwood noticed when Clara favored her left knee on damp days and made sure the heavy lifting got done by the ranch hands. Clara noticed when Elwood stared too long at the empty chairs around his dining table and made sure his favorite dessert appeared on particularly difficult evenings. The ranch employed 6 hands who lived in the bunkhouse near the barn, good men who respected their boss and nodded politely to Clara when their paths crossed. There was Pete Garrison, the foreman who'd worked for the Brandt family for 40 years and knew every fence post and water hole on the property. Miguel Santos handled the horses with the patience of a saint and the skill of a man born to the saddle. The younger hands Billy, Jake, Tom, and Frank rotated through seasonal work with the dedication of men who understood they worked for a fair boss who paid decent wages. In town, the Brandt name commanded respect that bordered on reverence. Elwood's grandfather had founded the bank that still anchored Main Street. His father had served 3 terms as mayor and donated the land for the school. Elwood himself sat on the hospital board, contributed generously to the church, and employed half the county during roundup season. When he walked into Murphy's General Store or the Cattleman's Cafe, conversations paused respectfully and hats came off weathered heads. But respect, Clara had observed over the years, was a cold companion at the supper table. She'd watched Elwood age from a man in his prime to one who carried the weight of too many empty years. His wife Margaret had died in a car accident when Elwood was 53, leaving him rattling around in a house built for a family he'd never had. They'd tried for children during their 15-year marriage, but the babies never came, and Margaret's death had closed that door forever. Clara understood loss. She'd buried her husband and watched her son move away to build a life that had little room for an aging mother who cleaned other people's houses. But where her faith had sustained her through the dark times, Elwood's grief had hardened into a loneliness that wealth couldn't touch. She'd been working for the Brandts for only 3 years when Margaret died, hired initially to help during Margaret's frequent illnesses. After the funeral, Elwood had asked her to stay on full-time, and Clara had accepted, grateful for steady work and a place to live in the small apartment above the carriage house that had been converted for visiting family who never visited. The work was honest and the pay fair, but more than that, Clara had found something approaching peace in the rhythm of caring for the big house and the quiet man who inhabited it like a ghost in his own life. She cooked meals he ate without tasting, cleaned rooms he barely used, and gradually became the only constant in a world that had taken everything he'd truly cared about. Over the years, she'd learned to read his moods in the set of his shoulders, the length of his silences, the way he stood at the window, watching cattle graze in pastures that stretched toward horizons he'd never cross. She knew he favored his right leg where an old horse had kicked him, that he read mystery novels but told no one, and that he sometimes stood in the doorway of what had been meant as a nursery, though he thought she didn't notice. In return, he'd learned that she sent nearly every penny she earned to help her son's family, that she wrote letters on Sunday afternoons that never seemed to generate replies, and that her humming grew softer on the anniversaries of her husband's death. He knew she mended her clothes rather than buy new ones, that she'd never owned a car and walked the 2 miles to town when she needed supplies, and that she possessed a dignity that poverty couldn't touch. Neither spoke of these observations. Their relationship existed in the space between employer and employee, marked by mutual respect and careful distance. Clara called him Mr. Brandt, and he called her Mrs. Hutchins, though the formality felt increasingly hollow after 2 decades of shared silence and small kindnesses. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the kitchen in warm light, as Clara finished the breakfast dishes and began planning the day's tasks. Upstairs, she changed the linens in bedrooms that rarely saw visitors, dust furniture that already gleamed, and vacuum carpets that showed no footprints save her own and Elwood's. In the afternoon, she'd tend the vegetable garden behind the house, hanging laundry on the line where it would catch the prairie wind and the scent of wildflowers. Elwood would spend his day riding fence lines, checking on cattle, meeting with Pete about ranch business, and handling the correspondence that came with owning the largest spread in 3 counties. But come evening, he'd find himself back on the porch, listening to Clara hum while she prepared supper, watching the sun set over land that meant everything and nothing to a man with no one to leave it to. In town, folks sometimes wondered why a rich widower hadn't remarried, why he rattled around that big house with only a housekeeper for company. The bolder ones among the church ladies had made their intentions known over the years, bringing casseroles and conversation, offering companionship to a man who seemed determined to remain alone. But Clara understood what the church ladies didn't, that some kinds of loneliness run too deep for casual companionship to reach. She'd seen it in the way Elwood's eyes went distant during conversations, how he nodded politely at social invitations he'd never accept, and how he held himself apart even in crowds, wealthy and respected, but fundamentally unreachable. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that Elwood had been watching her just as carefully as she'd been watching him, that her morning songs had become the sound he woke up hoping to hear, that her quiet presence had transformed his empty house into something that almost felt like home, that 20 years of shared silences had built something between them that neither could name but both had come to depend on. As the morning wore on toward noon, Clara moved through her familiar routines while Elwood handled ranch business, both of them navigating around the truth that hung between them like morning mist, that somewhere in the space between employer and employee, between wealth and poverty, between his loneliness and hers, something had grown that neither was quite ready to acknowledge. The sun reached its zenith over the Brandt ranch, painting everything in harsh, honest light that left no shadows to hide in. Soon, very soon, that light would illuminate truths that had lived too long in darkness, and the careful distance Clara and Elwood had maintained for 20 years would prove as fragile as morning frost beneath the Wyoming sun. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, carried by the postal truck that kicked up dust clouds visible from the ranch house porch. Clara's hands trembled as she recognized her son David's handwriting on the envelope, though something about the urgency of the script made her stomach tighten with foreboding. She'd been expecting his monthly letter-polite updates about the grandchildren's school activities and his wife Linda's garden, but this had arrived 2 weeks early. She waited until Elwood left for the south pasture before sitting at the kitchen table to read it, her coffee growing cold as her eyes moved across words that seemed to blur with each sentence. "Mom," the letter began, "I hate to burden you with this, but I don't have anyone else to turn to. Linda's been diagnosed with diabetes, and the medical bills are piling up faster than my teacher's salary can handle. The insurance doesn't cover everything, and we're looking at thousands of dollars in expenses. Little Sarah needs surgery on her ear. It's not life-threatening, but she can't hear properly, and it's affecting her schoolwork. I've already taken a second job working weekends at the hardware store, but it's not enough." Clara's heart clenched as she read on. David had always been proud, too proud to ask for help, even when his father was alive, and they'd had more to give. The fact that he was reaching out now meant things were worse than he was letting on. "I know you don't have much," the letter continued, "and I hate asking, but if you could spare anything, even $50 would help with Sarah's medical bills. I'm hoping to get approved for a loan, but the bank wants to see that we have some money saved first. I wouldn't ask if I wasn't desperate. The kids don't know how bad things are, and Linda's trying to stay strong, but I can see the worry in her eyes every day." The letter was signed simply, "Love, David," with a postscript that nearly broke her heart. "I'm sorry I've been such a poor son, not writing more or visiting. I know you must get lonely out there." Clara folded the letter with shaking hands and placed it in the old cigar box where she kept her important papers. Then she walked to her bedroom and retrieved the envelope from behind her dresser mirror, where she kept her savings, 7 $20 bills and a handful of coins that represented 3 months of careful economy. $147.38. Her entire emergency fund, saved penny by penny from a salary that barely covered her basic needs. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough for what David needed, but it was everything she had. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, holding the money in her hands and feeling the weight of impossible choices. If she sent it all, she'd have nothing left for her own emergencies. Winter was coming, and her coat was wearing thin. Her shoes had holes she'd been hiding with cardboard insoles. But David was her son, her only child, and his children needed help she could provide. The sound of boots on the back porch interrupted her thoughts. Elwood had returned earlier than expected, and she could hear him washing his hands at the kitchen sink. Quickly, she tucked the money back in its hiding place and smoothed her hair, not wanting him to see her distress. "Mrs. Hutchins," his voice carried from the kitchen, unusually hesitant. "Could I trouble you for some coffee?" She found him standing by the window, still wearing his work clothes, and the expression of a man wrestling with something he couldn't quite name. His usual commanding presence seemed diminished, as if the morning's work had taken more out of him than it should. "Of course, Mr. Brandt." She moved to the stove, grateful for the familiar routine. "How were the cattle?" "Fine. All fine." He sat heavily in the chair he'd claimed as his own during their shared coffee breaks, a recent development that had started when she'd offered him a cup on a particularly cold morning last spring. "Pete thinks we might lose some calves if this cold snap continues." Clara poured coffee into 2 cups, noting how Elwood's hands wrapped around the ceramic as if seeking warmth from more than just the liquid. She'd learned to read his moods over the years, and today something was different. The air between them felt charged with unspoken tension. "Mrs. Hutchins," he said after a long silence, "is everything all right? You seem—" He paused, searching for words, troubled. The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. In 20 years, he'd never asked about her personal life, never crossed the invisible line between employer and employee. But today, sitting across from him in the warm kitchen with October light streaming through the windows, that line seemed as fragile as tissue paper. "I'm fine, Mr. Brandt. Just tired, I expect." He studied her face with eyes that missed nothing. "You received a letter today." It wasn't a question. Clara realized he must have seen the postal truck, noticed her distraction, read the worry she thought she'd hidden. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Bad news?" The simple question opened a floodgate she hadn't expected. Perhaps it was the gentleness in his tone, or the way the morning light softened his weathered features, or simply the fact that she'd been carrying her burdens alone for so long. Whatever the reason, Clara found herself speaking words she'd never intended to say. "My son's family is struggling financially. His wife is ill, and my granddaughter needs surgery. I want to help them, but—" She stopped, horrified that she'd revealed so much. "But you don't have the money." The blunt statement should have embarrassed her, but something in Elwood's voice, understanding rather than judgment, made her nod. "I have some savings," she said quietly. "Not much, but—" "How much do they need?" Clara looked up sharply, startled by the directness of his question. "Mr. Brandt, I didn't mean to burden you with my problems. I shouldn't have." "How much?" he repeated, his voice gentler but insistent. "Several $1,000s. The words came out as barely a whisper. "For medical bills and the surgery. I know it's impossible." "It's not impossible." The simple statement hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to see built. Clara stared at him, understanding dawning slowly. "Mr. Brandt, I couldn't accept." "You're not accepting anything. You're allowing me to help a family in need. There's a difference." Clara shook her head, her pride warring with her desperation. "I can't take charity. I won't." "It's not charity." Elwood's voice carried a firmness she'd never heard when he spoke to her. "You've worked for this family for 20 years. You've earned more consideration than you've ever asked for." They sat in silence, the offer hanging between them like a question neither knew how to answer. Clara felt tears threatening and fought them back, her lifetime of independence battling against her love for her son and his family. "I would pay you back," she said finally, "every penny, even if it took years." "I know you would." Elwood's smile was sadder than she'd ever seen it. But you wouldn't need to. Consider it a bonus for 2 decades of faithful service. Mr. Brandt. Elwood. The word came out so quietly she almost missed it. After 20 years, I think you could call me Elwood. The intimacy of his first name on her lips felt like crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. Clara looked into his eyes and saw something she'd never noticed before, a loneliness that matched her own, a need for connection that wealth couldn't satisfy. "Elwood," she said softly, and watched something shift in his expression. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll let me help." His hand moved across the table, not quite touching hers, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "Say you'll stop carrying every burden alone." Clara looked down at their handsheets, large and scarred from ranch work, hers smaller and worn from years of cleaning and mending. Between them lay 20 years of careful distance, mutual respect, and something deeper that neither had dared to name. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for me?" Elwood was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of unspoken truth. "Because in 20 years of living in this house, you're the only thing that's ever made it feel like home." The words settled between them like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would change everything that came after. Clara felt her world shifting, realigning around this moment when her wealthy employer became simply a man offering kindness to a woman in need. Outside, the Wyoming wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the scent of approaching winter. Inside the warm kitchen, 2 lonely people sat across from each other, finally acknowledging what had been growing between them like wildflowers in the space between propriety and need. The letter from her son lay in its cigar box, crisis temporarily lifted by an act of generosity. Clara was still learning to accept. But she understood, even in her gratitude, that Elwood's offer had changed something fundamental between them. The careful distance they'd maintained was crumbling, and neither of them knew what would rise in its place. That night, Elwood stood in his bedroom, holding the gold wedding band he'd worn on a chain around his neck for 15 years. Margaret's ring had been buried with her, but his own had felt too heavy for his finger, after the funeral too much of a promise to a future that would never come. Wearing it close to his heart had seemed like a compromise between honoring the past and acknowledging his solitude. Now, in the lamplight of his bedroom, the ring felt different in his palm. Not lighter, exactly, but less like a chain and more like a memento of something beautiful that had ended naturally, the way seasons end to make room for what comes next. He thought about Clara's face when he'd offered to help her son, the way her eyes had filled with tears she'd been too proud to shed. In that moment, he'd seen past 20 years of careful formality to the woman, beneath vulnerable, fierce in her love for her family, and so accustomed to carrying burdens alone that his offer of help had shaken her to her core. The truth was, he'd been wanting to help her for years. He'd noticed her mended clothes, her worn shoes, the way she counted out exact change when Pete picked up supplies for her in town. He'd seen her rationing her own meals to save money, though she'd never let his table lack for anything. Her dignity had been a wall he couldn't scale without invitation, but her son's crisis had finally given him an opening. What he hadn't expected was how offering to help would feel like the first meaningful thing he'd done in years. Margaret had been his first love, his only lover, so he'd believed. Their marriage had been built on shared histories and comfortable expectations, 2 prominent families joining forces in the way such things had been done for generations. He'd loved her genuinely, if quietly, and her death had left him not just alone, but convinced that his capacity for deep feeling had died with her. Clara was different. She'd crept into his awareness gradually, like sunrise painting the eastern sky so slowly. He hadn't noticed the darkness lifting until he found himself looking forward to her humming, timing his morning coffee to coincide with her arrival, feeling the house come alive when she was in it and settle into emptiness when she left. He'd told himself it was gratitude for her excellent service, appreciation for her quiet competence. He'd convinced himself that his interest in her small routinesse, the way she arranged flowers, how she hummed hymns while working, the gentle efficiency with which she moved through his world, was merely the observation of a man with too much time on his hands. But when she'd spoken of her son's troubles, when he'd seen her fighting tears over her inability to help her family, something had shifted in his chest, like ice breaking up on the river in spring. The need to help her, to spare her that pain, had been so immediate and powerful it had frightened him. Downstairs, Clara was finishing the evening dishes, her soft humming drifting up through the old house like incense. The melody was Blessed Assurance, a hymn he remembered from childhood Sundays, when his mother had still been alive to drag him to church. Clara's voice gave the old song new meaning, made it sound like a prayer for better days ahead. He'd written the check that afternoon, $3,000 made out to David Hutchins, with a note explaining that it was a bonus for his mother's faithful service. Clara had tried to refuse it again, but he'd been firm, and eventually she'd accepted it with a grace that had made his chest tight with emotion he couldn't name. The next morning brought a shift in their routine as subtle as it was significant. Clara arrived at her usual time, but when she brought Elwood his coffee, she lingered at the kitchen table instead of immediately returning to her work. "The check," she said quietly. "I sent it to David yesterday. He called last night. I've never heard him cry before, not since he was a little boy." Elwood nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The gratitude in her voice was almost too much to bear. "He wanted me to thank you," she continued. "He said to tell you that you've saved his family." "No need for thanks. I'm glad I could help." They sat in comfortable silence, but it was different from their previous silences. The barrier between them had developed a crack, and through it flowed something warmer than mere courtesy. Clara's usual careful deference had softened into something approaching friendship. "Tell me about him," Elwood said. "Your son." Clara's face lit up in a way he'd never seen before. "David? He's a good man. Teaches 6th grade history in Columbia, Missouri. Has been for 10 years now. He's patient with his students, the way his father was patient with him." She told him about David's childhood, about the boy who'd collected rocks and read everything he could get his hands on, who'd worked summers at the railroad with his father and dreamed of seeing the world beyond Wyoming's borders. She spoke of his wife Linda, a kindergarten teacher who made quilts and grew prize-winning tomatoes, and of their children Sarah, 8, who wanted to be a veterinarian, and Michael, 6, who could already read chapter books. "They sound like fine people," Elwood said when she finished. "They are. I just wish—" She stopped herself, but he could fill in the rest. She wished she could see them more often, wished the distance between Wyoming and Missouri wasn't so vast, wished her grandbabies knew her as more than the woman who sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts she could barely afford. "You could visit them," he said carefully. "Now that their immediate crisis is past, I could advance you the money for a train ticket." Clara shook her head immediately. "I couldn't. You've already done too much." "Have I?" He studied her face, noting the way she'd started to look directly at him when they spoke, instead of keeping her eyes downcast. "Or have I finally done something worthwhile with money that's been sitting in the bank earning interest I don't need?" The question hung between them, challenging assumptions both had lived with for years. Clara had always seen her employer as a man so far above her station that accepting his help bordered on impropriety. Elwood had always told himself that maintaining distance was respectful, professional, appropriate. But that afternoon, when Clara was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, Elwood found himself watching from the kitchen window. She moved with unconscious grace, pinning sheets and shirts with economical motions while humming something low and sweet. The autumn light caught the silver in her hair, and for a moment she looked almost young, the way she might have looked 20 years ago when she'd first come to work for his family. Pete Garrison chose that moment to appear at Elwood's elbow, following his boss's gaze to where Clara worked in the golden afternoon light. "Fine woman," Pete said quietly. He'd known the Brandt family for 40 years and earned the right to speak his mind. Shame she's alone in that little apartment while you rattle around in this big house." Elwood's jaw tightened. "Pete, now don't go getting your back up. I'm just saying what every man in 3 counties can see plain as day. You two have been circling each other like shy teenagers for years, too polite to admit what's obvious to everyone else. Mrs. Hutchins is my employee. Mrs. Hutchins is a woman who's been taking care of you longer than most wives take care of their husbands, and you're a fool if you can't see the difference between service and devotion." Pete walked away before Elwood could respond, leaving him standing at the window with truths he wasn't ready to examine. But that evening, when Clara served his dinner, he found himself really looking at her not as his housekeeper, but as the woman who'd become essential to his daily contentment. She was beautiful, he realized with a start. Not in the way Margaret had been beautiful, all refined features and careful grooming, but in the way of a woman who'd earned her beauty through kindness, through strength, through years of quiet grace under pressure. The realization frightened him almost as much as it thrilled him, because it meant the feelings growing in his chest weren't gratitude or loneliness or the simple appreciation of a man for faithful service. It meant, God help him, that he was falling in love with Clara Mae Hutchins, and he had no idea what to do about it. 2 weeks after sending the money to her son, Clara discovered that her small acts of economy had become visible to eyes that had been watching more carefully than she'd realized. She'd been mending the same winter coat for 3 years, and when the November wind found every thin spot in the fabric, she simply wrapped herself more tightly and continued hanging laundry on the line. Elwood noticed everything. He saw her shiver as she worked, saw her examine the holes in her shoes before stepping outside, saw her count and recount the meager bills in her envelope before walking to town for supplies. The ranch ledger on his desk told a different story, pages of figures that represented more wealth than most towns would see in a lifetime. Cattle sales that brought in more money in a month than Clara would earn in 5 years. The contrast had begun to eat at him like acid. On a particularly cold Thursday morning, Clara was surprised to find a package on her kitchen tablet, heavy wool coat in deep blue, still bearing tags from Morrison's department store in Cheyenne. "Mr. Brandt," she began when he came in for coffee, "I can't accept this." "It's not a gift," he said, settling into his chair with studied casualness. "It's a uniform requirement. Can't have my housekeeper catching pneumonia because she's too stubborn to dress properly for Wyoming weather." Clara ran her hand over the coat's soft wool, noting the quality of the fabric, the perfect stitching, the price tag that represented 2 weeks of her wages. "This is too expensive for a uniform." "Clara." Her name on his lips stopped her protests cold. He'd been using her first name more often lately, and each time it felt like a small intimacy, a step closer to something neither wanted to name. "Please, just accept that someone wants to make sure you're warm." She looked at him across the kitchen table, this man who owned everything she could see from the windows and more besides, yet somehow seemed to find joy only in small acts of kindness toward her. His ledger lay open beside his coffee cup, and she could see numbers that made her head spin, the casual wealth of a man who could buy a dozen coats without noticing the expense. "Thank you," she said quietly, because she could see that refusing would hurt him more than accepting would compromise her pride. That afternoon, when she walked to town wearing her new coat, she felt the curious stares of neighbors who recognized expensive fabric when they saw it. Old Mrs. Patterson from the post office made a point of commenting on how fine Clara looked, and Tom Bradley at the general store asked if she'd come into some money. Clara deflected the questions with grace, but she understood the implication. A woman in her position didn't wear $100 coats unless something significant had changed in her circumstances. The town was small enough that people noticed such things, and speculation about the nature of her relationship with Elwood Brandt was inevitable. The thought troubled her more than she wanted to admit. That evening, she found herself sitting across from Elwood at the kitchen table, another change in their routine that had happened, so gradually she couldn't pinpoint when it started. He'd begun joining her for coffee after dinner, claiming he enjoyed the company, and she'd stopped questioning the propriety of it because she enjoyed it too. "The coat caused quite a stir in town," she said, testing the waters. Elwood's expression darkened. People talking. They're curious. A woman like me doesn't usually wear such fine things. A woman like you deserves better than she usually gets. The words came out sharper than he'd intended, and Clara looked up in surprise. I'm sorry. It bothers me that you've been making do with so little when there's no need for it. There's every need for it. I work for wages, Elwood. I can't accept expensive gifts just because you feel sorry for me. Is that what you think this is? Pity? Clara studied his face, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped his coffee cup. What else could it be? The question hung between them like a challenge. Elwood stared into his coffee, wrestling with words that felt too dangerous to speak aloud. Finally, he looked up, and Clara saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It could be a man realizing that the woman who's been taking care of his house for 20 years has been taking care of him too, in ways he never asked for and never properly thanked her for. It could be someone finally understanding that all the money in the world doesn't mean anything if you don't have someone to share it with. The words settled between them like stones dropped into still water. Clara felt her heart racing, torn between the impossibility of what he seemed to be suggesting and the recognition of her own feelings she'd been trying to ignore. Elwood, I know it's not proper. I know there are differences between us that people would find difficult to overlook. But Clara, in 20 years of living in this house, you're the only thing that's ever made it feel like a home instead of a museum. Clara's hands trembled as she set down her coffee cup. You don't know what you're saying, don't I? He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Do you think I haven't noticed how empty this place feels when you're not here? Do you think I don't look forward to your humming in the morning, to these conversations in the evening? Do you think I don't know that I've been half in love with you for years, and just too much of a coward to admit it? The confession hung in the air between them, impossible to take back. Clara stared at him, her mind reeling with the implications of what he'd just said. A wealthy rancher didn't fall in love with his housekeeper, at least not in ways that led anywhere but heartbreak for the woman involved. You can't mean that, she whispered. I mean every word. He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his skin. I know it's complicated. I know there are obstacles. Obstacles? Clara's voice rose slightly. Elwood, I clean your house. I cook your meals. Half this town remembers when you were married to Margaret Thornton, the banker's daughter. What you're suggesting? What I'm suggesting is that two lonely people who found comfort in each other's company might have found something more valuable than either of them realized. Clara stood abruptly, pacing to the window where she could see the lights of town twinkling in the distance. Each light represented people who knew her as Elwood Brandt's housekeeper, nothing more. The idea of becoming something else, something that would invite speculation and judgment, terrified her almost as much as the growing certainty that her own feelings for him ran deeper than she'd allowed herself to acknowledge. I need to think, she said without turning around. Of course. His voice was gentle, understanding. Clara, nothing has to change. We can keep things exactly as they are, if that's what you want. But I needed you to know. You deserve to know that you mean more to me than just faithful service. That night, Clara lay in her narrow bed in the apartment above the carriage house, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of the emotions churning in her chest. The coat hung in her closet, tangible proof that Elwood saw her as more than an employee. His words echoed in her mind, and she found herself remembering moments over the years when she'd felt his attention on her, when their conversations had lingered longer than necessary, when his smile had seemed warmer than mere courtesy required. She'd been a widow for 10 years, long enough to forget what it felt like to have a man look at her with interest, with affection, with something that might be love. The possibility terrified and thrilled her in equal measure, because she was no longer sure she could pretend her own feelings were purely professional. The envelope behind her dresser mirror was empty now, her savings gone to help her son's family. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel poor. She felt like a woman standing at the edge of something that could change her life forever if she was brave enough to step forward into the unknown. The photograph of Thomas Hutchins had sat on Clara's dresser for 10 years, a constant reminder of the vows she'd made to love, honor, and cherish until death parted them. In the picture, Thomas wore his railroad uniform, his smile wide and genuine, his eyes crinkled with the laugh lines she'd fallen in love with when she was barely 17. He'd been a good man, a faithful husband, a devoted father, everything a woman could ask for in a partner. But Thomas had been gone for a decade, and Clara was beginning to understand that holding onto his memory so tightly might be preventing her from embracing whatever future God had planned for her. The realization came to her gradually over the days following Elwood's confession. She found herself comparing the two men, Thomas, who'd been her first and only love, steady and reliable as sunrise, and Elwood, whose quiet strength had become such a constant in her life that she'd stopped noticing when appreciation had deepened into something more complex. Thomas had been her equal in all the ways that mattered. They'd grown up in the same circumstances, shared the same modest dreams, built a life together from nothing but love and determination. Elwood represented something entirely different, a world of privilege and expectations she didn't understand, complications that came with wealth and social position. Yet when she was honest with herself, Clara had to admit that the man who sat across from her at the kitchen table each evening, speaking softly about ranch business or asking about her day, bore little resemblance to the wealthy rancher the town saw. With her, he was simply Elwood, lonely, kind, and surprisingly vulnerable beneath his commanding exterior. The conversation came on a snowy December morning when they were sharing coffee while the wind rattled the windows. Clara had been unusually quiet, and Elwood finally asked what was troubling her. "I've been thinking about Thomas," she said, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup for warmth. "About what he would think of," she gestured vaguely between them. "This." Elwood's expression grew carefully neutral. "And what do you think he would think?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, studying the worn gold band on her left hand. "Thomas was a good man, the best man I've ever known, until—" She stopped, realizing what she'd almost said. "Until?" Elwood's voice was gentle, encouraging. "Until I met you." The words came out as barely a whisper. "And that terrifies me, because I never thought I could feel this way about anyone else." Elwood reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the first time he'd touched her, beyond the casual brushing of fingers when passing dishes or papers. His hand was warm, calloused from ranch work, completely different from Thomas's, but somehow right. "Tell me about him," he said, "about your marriage." Clara looked surprised. "You want to know about my late husband?" "I want to know about the man who was lucky enough to have your love. For how long were you married?" 15 years. Clara's voice grew soft with memory. "We were childhood sweethearts. Married when I was 18, had David when I was 20. Thomas worked hard, provided for us the best he could. We never had much money, but we were happy." "What was he like?" "Patient, kind. He never raised his voice, never complained about working double shifts when times were hard. He used to bring me wildflowers he picked along the railroad tracks." Clara smiled at the memory. "Every Sunday after church, he'd take David fishing while I made dinner. Simple pleasures, simple life." Elwood listened without judgment, understanding that she needed to speak of Thomas before she could move forward. "You loved him very much." "I did. He was my whole world for 23 years, from the time I was 17 until the day he died." Clara met Elwood's eyes directly. "But he's been gone for 10 years, and I'm beginning to think that holding on to grief isn't the same as honoring his memory." "What do you mean?" Clara pulled her hand free and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered pastures. "Thomas always said he wanted me to be happy. When he was dying, he made me promise not to spend the rest of my life alone. I thought that meant I should focus on being a good mother and grandmother, but maybe—" She turned back to face him. "Maybe he meant I should be open to love again if it found me." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Pete Garrison, who stamped snow from his boots and accepted Clara's offer of coffee. But Pete's presence reminded them both that their growing closeness hadn't gone unnoticed by others. Town's buzzing about the Henderson place going up for sale, Pete said, settling into a chair. Old man Henderson finally decided to move to Florida with his daughter. Good land, Elwood replied. Someone will snap it up quick. Yep, though folks are more interested in talking about other things these days. Pete's eyes flicked meaningfully between Elwood and Clara. Seems some people have noticed changes around here. Clara felt her cheeks warm. What kind of changes? Oh, just that Mr. Brandt here seems considerably more cheerful lately, and that you've been looking mighty fine in that new coat. Pete's tone was carefully neutral, but his meaning was clear. Small towns, you know. People notice things. After Pete left, Clara and Elwood sat in uncomfortable silence. The reality of their situation, the impossibility of conducting any kind of relationship under the scrutiny of an entire community, settled between them like a heavy blanket. What are people saying? Clara asked finally. Elwood's jaw tightened. Does it matter? Of course it matters. I have to live in this town, work here, shop here. If people think I'm... She couldn't finish the sentence. If people think you're... what? Important to me? Cared for? Deserving of respect and consideration? If people think I'm taking advantage of my position, if they think I'm... Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. If they think I'm your mistress. The ugly word hung between them, giving voice to the assumptions Clara knew some people would inevitably make. A wealthy widower and his housekeeper was the kind of gossip that could destroy her reputation and reduce their relationship to something sordid and shameful. Elwood stood abruptly, his face dark with anger. Anyone who knows you would never think such a thing. Anyone who knows me knows I'm the hired help. There's a difference. Not to me there isn't. But there is to everyone else. Clara's voice was patient but firm. Elwood, you're one of the most respected men in 3 counties. Your family founded this town. People look up to you, depend on you. I'm a widow who cleans houses for a living. The social distance between us might as well be an ocean. Then maybe it's time people learned that respect has nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with character. Elwood moved closer to her, his voice intense. You have more dignity in your little finger than most people have in their entire bodies. You've worked harder, sacrificed more, and shown more grace under pressure than anyone I've ever known. If this town can't see that, then this town is blind. Clara felt tears threatening at the fierce protectiveness in his voice. It's not that simple, isn't it? He reached for her hands, holding them gently. Clara, I'm 68 years old. I've spent 15 years being what people expected me to be, the grieving widower, the responsible landowner, the pillar of the community, and I've been miserable. These past few weeks, talking with you, being honest about my feelings, I've felt more alive than I have in years. But at what cost? Clara searched his face. Your standing in the community, your reputation, the respect you've spent a lifetime earning. What good is respect if it comes at the cost of happiness? What good is a reputation built on living a lie? That evening, Clara sat in her small apartment, turning Thomas's photograph in her hands. His smile looked the same as always, warm, encouraging, full of the love they'd shared. But for the first time in 10 years, she found herself wondering what he would really think about her situation. Thomas had been a practical man, a man who believed in honest work and simple pleasures. But he'd also been a man who'd wanted her to be happy, who'd made her promise not to waste her life in grief. Would he understand that she'd found something unexpected with Elwood? Would he approve of a love that crossed social boundaries but felt as real as anything she'd ever experienced? The answer, when it came to her, was as clear as Thomas's voice in her memory. He would want her to follow her heart, regardless of what other people thought. But following her heart meant risking everything she'd built in this town, everything she'd worked for, everything she'd accepted as the natural order of her world. It meant being brave enough to reach for happiness even when it came in a form she'd never expected. Outside her window, snow continued to fall on the Brandt ranch, covering everything in pristine white. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to choose between safety and possibility. Clara placed Thomas's photograph back on her dresser, but for the first time in 10 years, She didn't say her usual good-night prayer to his memory. Instead, she found herself praying for wisdom, for courage, and for the strength to trust that real love was worth whatever risks it required. The quilt had been Clara's mother's, stitched during the long winter evenings when Clara was small and her father worked late at the sawmill. Each square told a story fabric from Clara's childhood dresses, scraps from her mother's Sunday best, pieces of her father's worn work shirts, transformed into something beautiful and lasting. It was the only thing of real value Clara owned, and she treasured it not for its monetary worth, but for the love woven into every careful stitch. She'd been sitting on her narrow bed, mending a small tear in the quilt's edge, when the knock came at her door. It was nearly 8 o'clock on a cold January evening, and Clara couldn't imagine who would be visiting at such an hour. Her son David stood on her doorstep, his coat dusted with snow and his face bearing an expression she hadn't seen since he was a teenager, caught in some mischief. "David!" Clara's heart leaped with joy and concern in equal measure. "What are you doing here? How did you get here? Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, Mom." He stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots and looking around the small apartment with eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail. "I took the train to Cheyenne and rented a car. I needed to see you." Clara bustled around, making coffee and setting out the few cookies she'd baked for herself, her mind racing with questions. David's unexpected visit filled her with happiness, but she could see tension in the set of his shoulders, purpose in the way he studied her living space. "How's Linda, the children? Did the surgery go well?" "Sarah's hearing is perfect now, thanks to your boss's generosity." David settled into the single chair by the window, accepting the coffee gratefully. "That's actually why I'm here. I wanted to thank Mr. Brandt in person, but I also wanted to talk to you about some things I've been hearing." Clara's hands stilled on her coffee cup. "What kind of things?" "Mom, you know I love you. You know I'm grateful for everything you've sacrificed for me over the years." David's voice was gentle but serious. "But I'm concerned about your situation here." "My situation?" "Your relationship with Elwood Brandt." The careful way he said Elwood's name told Clara that David knew more than she'd expected. She set down her coffee and studied her son's face, seeing Thomas's features mixed with her own, and the stubborn determination that had carried him through college and into his teaching career. "Who have you been talking to?" "Linda has a cousin who lives in Rawlins. Word travels, Mom. People are talking about you and Mr. Brandt, about how close you two have become. About expensive gifts and changed routines and—" David paused, choosing his words carefully. "About the kind of relationship that could damage your reputation." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "And what exactly do people think they know about my relationship with my employer?" "They think he's taking advantage of you. They think you're—" David struggled with the words. "They think you're compromising yourself for financial security." The accusation hung in the small room like smoke. Clara stood and walked to the window, looking out at the ranch house where warm light glowed in the kitchen windows. She could imagine Elwood there, perhaps reading by the fire or reviewing ranch accounts, probably wondering why she hadn't joined him for their usual evening coffee. "Is that what you think?" she asked quietly. "I don't know what to think. That's why I'm here." David joined her at the window. "Mom, you raised me to be independent, to make my own way in the world. You taught me that dignity comes from honest work and self-respect. But this situation, it looks like you're trading on your relationship with a wealthy man to improve your circumstances." Clara turned to face her son, seeing genuine concern in his eyes, along with the protective instinct that made him want to shield her from gossip and judgment. "David, what if I told you that your understanding of the situation is incomplete?" "Then help me understand, because right now, all I see is my mother accepting expensive gifts from her employer and spending her evenings in his house instead of her own apartment. It looks like—" "Like what?" "Like I'm his kept woman." Clara's voice was sharper than she'd intended. "Like I'm some desperate widow willing to sell herself for security?" David winced. "That's not what I meant." "Isn't it?" Clara moved to the dresser and picked up Thomas's photograph, holding it like a talisman. "Your father was a good man, David. an honorable man. Do you think he would have married a woman capable of what you're suggesting? Of course not. But Dad's been gone for 10 years, and people change when they're desperate. Am I desperate? Clara's voice was quiet, but David could hear the steel beneath the softness. I have a job, a place to live, enough money for my needs. I sent you $3,000 when your family was in crisis. Does that sound like desperation to you? David had the grace to look ashamed. I'm grateful for that money, more grateful than I can say, but that's part of what worries me. Where did it come from? Your salary couldn't possibly... It came from a man who's been watching me struggle for 20 years and finally found a way to help that I couldn't refuse. Clara set down the photograph and faced her son directly. It came from someone who cares about me enough to want my family to be safe and healthy. Mum, let me finish. Clara's voice carried the authority of a mother who'd raised a strong-willed son through childhood and adolescence. You're concerned about my reputation, about what people are saying, but what you're really concerned about is your own embarrassment. You don't want to be the son whose mother is gossiped about in small towns across Wyoming. The words hit their mark, and David's face flushed. That's not fair, isn't it? You drove 800 miles to check on me, but not because you were worried about my happiness or well-being. You came because you were worried about appearances. Clara moved to the small closet and pulled out the blue wool coat, holding it up for David to see. This coat cost more than I earn in a month. A man gave it to me because he noticed I was cold and wanted me to be warm. Is that the act of someone taking advantage or someone who cares? David stared at the coat, recognizing quality when he saw it. It's a beautiful coat, Mom. But gifts like that come with expectations. What expectations? That I continue to cook his meals and clean his house, the same as I've done for 20 years? That I sit with him in the evenings and listen to him talk about ranch business and cattle prices? That I hum while I work because it makes him smile? Clara's voice softened as she spoke, and David could hear something in it he'd never heard before, a warmth, a tenderness that had nothing to do with duty or gratitude. You care about him, David said, understanding dawning in his voice. Yes, I do. Clara folded the coat carefully and returned it to the closet. More than I expected to care about anyone after your father died. And he cares about me in ways that have nothing to do with my position as his employee. David was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. Mom, the social differences are significant, yes. He's wealthy, respected, from an old family. I'm a widow who cleans houses. If we were characters in a novel, people would call it impossible. Clara sat back down, her hands folded in her lap. But we're not characters in a novel. We're two people who found something unexpected together, something that makes both our lives richer. But what kind of future can you have? He can't marry you. The social scandal would destroy both of you. The question Clara had been avoiding, the reality she hadn't wanted to face, lay between them now like a chasm. She thought of the evenings spent talking across the kitchen table, of the growing intimacy in their conversations, of the way Elwood's eyes softened when he looked at her. She thought of the town's gossip, of the social barriers that seemed insurmountable, of the careful distance she'd maintained for 20 years finally crumbling. I don't know, she admitted. All I know is that for the first time in 10 years, I feel alive again. I feel valued for more than just the work I do. I feel... She paused, searching for the right word. I feel loved. David reached for his mother's hands, holding them gently. I want you to be happy, Mom. I really do. But I'm scared that you're going to get hurt. Life is full of chances to get hurt, son. The question is whether the possibility of pain is worth the certainty of loneliness. That night, after David had returned to the hotel in town where he'd taken a room, Clara sat with her mother's quilt spread across her lap, thinking about the conversation. Her son's concerns weren't unfounded. The social obstacles were real, the potential for gossip and judgment significant. But his visit had also clarified something important for her. She was tired of living her life according to other people's expectations, tired of measuring her worth by their standards. tired of denying her own feelings because they didn't fit the narrow definition of what was appropriate for a woman in her position. Tomorrow, David would meet Elwood, would judge for himself the man who'd become so important to his mother. Clara could only hope that her son would see what she saw: not a wealthy man taking advantage of his position, but a lonely soul who'd found his match in an unexpected place. Outside her window, snow continued to fall on the ranch that had become more home to her than anywhere she'd ever lived. Inside, Clara pulled her mother's quilt closer around her shoulders and made a decision that would change everything. She was going to stop apologizing for caring about Elwood Brandt and start fighting for the chance to build something real with him. The manila envelope arrived by special courier on a Tuesday morning in February, bearing the letterhead of Hartwell, Morrison, Associates, the law firm that had handled the Brandt family's affairs for 3 generations. Clara signed for it at the kitchen door, noting the weight of the package and the formal seal that suggested important business inside. She carried it to Elwood's office, where he was reviewing feed invoices and planning the spring roundup. The sight of the legal documents made him frown. His lawyer, James Hartwell, usually called before sending papers requiring his signature. "More estate planning documents," Elwood muttered, breaking the seal. "James has been after me for months to update my will." Clara was turning to leave when Elwood's sharp intake of breath stopped her at the door. She turned back to find him staring at the papers with an expression she'd never seen before: shock, mixed with something that might have been panic. "Mr. Brandt, is everything all right?" Elwood looked up at her, his face pale beneath his weathered tan. "Clara, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." The formality in his voice, the return to her last name, sent a chill through her. "Of course. Have you been in my office recently? Gone through my desk or filing cabinets?" Clara's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Only to dust and clean, the same as always. Why would you ask such a thing?" Elwood held up the papers, his hand trembling slightly. "Because someone has been asking questions about my finances, my property holdings, my will. Someone with detailed knowledge of my personal affairs." The implication hit Clara like a physical blow. "You think I've been spying on you?" "I don't know what to think. These papers," Elwood's voice was tight with anger and hurt. "They're from a private investigator James hired to look into some unusual inquiries about my estate. Someone has been asking very specific questions about my holdings, my bank accounts, my plans for the ranch." Clara moved closer to the desk, her heart pounding. "What kind of questions?" "Questions about beneficiaries, about whether I have any heirs, about the value of the property and liquid assets." Elwood's eyes met hers, and she saw suspicion there that cut deeper than any knife. "Questions that suggest someone is very interested in what happens to my money when I die." The words hung in the air between them like poison. Clara felt the world shifting beneath her feet, 20 years of trust and respect crumbling in the space of a few sentences. "You think I'm after your money?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't want to think that, but Clara, these inquiries started shortly after we began, after our relationship changed. The timing is too convenient to ignore." Clara's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "So everything that's happened between us, everything we've shared, you think it's been calculated? You think I've been playing some kind of long game, waiting 20 years to seduce you for your inheritance?" Elwood's silence was answer enough. Clara turned and walked to the window, looking out at the ranch that had been her world for 2 decades. The cattle grazed peacefully in the winter pasture, unaware that the foundation of everything she'd built was cracking beneath her feet. 20 years, she said quietly. 20 years I've worked for your family. I've cleaned your house, cooked your meals, mended your clothes. I've listened to your troubles, celebrated your successes, and asked for nothing beyond my wages. And you think it's all been an elaborate scheme to get my hands on your money? Clara. She whirled around, her eyes blazing with hurt and fury. Do you have any idea how insulting that is? Do you think so little of me that you believe I'm capable of such deception? I don't know what to believe. The evidence is 20 years of faithful service. The evidence is that I've had access to your office, your files, your personal papers for decades, and I've never once violated that trust. The evidence is that I've turned down your offers of help time and again because I was too proud to accept charity." Elwood stood, moving around the desk toward her. "Then explain this. Explain how someone knows so much about my private affairs." "I can't explain it, and I shouldn't have to. The fact that you're asking me to proves how little you know me after all these years." Clara moved toward the door, her dignity intact, despite the pain radiating through her chest. "I'll pack my things and be gone by evening." "Clara, wait." "No." She turned back to face him one last time. "You want to know the truth, Elwood? The truth is that I did fall in love with you. I fell in love with a man I thought was kind and generous and trustworthy. I fell in love with someone I thought saw me as more than just hired help. But that man wouldn't look at me with suspicion in his eyes. That man wouldn't believe I was capable of manipulating him for money." She left him standing in his office, surrounded by legal documents and the wreckage of whatever they'd been building together. Clara was in her apartment, pulling clothes from the dresser, when she heard voices from the main house. Through her window, she could see David's rental car in the driveway he'd come, as planned to meet Elwood and discuss her situation. The irony wasn't lost on her that her son would finally get his wish to see her relationship with Elwood ended, just not in the way he'd expected. She continued packing, folding her few possessions into the suitcase she'd brought to the ranch 20 years ago. The blue wool coat went in last, and she found herself staring at it for a long moment. A gift given in kindness, now tainted by suspicion and doubt. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find David standing there, his face a mask of confusion and concern. "Mum, what's going on? Mr. Brandt said you were leaving, that there'd been some kind of misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding." Clara's voice was steady, but David could see the pain in her eyes. "Your concerns about my relationship with Elwood were valid, just not in the way you thought." "I don't understand." Clara told him about the private investigator's report, about Elwood's suspicions, about the accusation that had shattered everything she'd believed about their relationship. As she spoke, David's expression grew increasingly troubled. "Mum, that's impossible. You would never." "Of course I wouldn't, but apparently 20 years of faithful service isn't enough to earn the benefit of the doubt." David was quiet for a moment, his mind working. "Mum, what if the investigator was wrong? What if someone else has been asking questions about Mr. Brandt's affairs? It doesn't matter now. The damage is done." "But it does matter. If you're innocent, and of course you are, then someone else is responsible. Someone who wanted to drive a wedge between you and Mr. Brandt." Clara paused in her packing, considering her son's words. "Who would do such a thing? And why?" "I don't know. But Mom, you can't leave without fighting for the truth. If you run away now, people will assume you're guilty. They'll believe you were after his money all along." The observation hit home. Clara realized that her leaving would only confirm the town's suspicions, would validate every piece of gossip about her relationship with Elwood. It would destroy not only her reputation, but also any possibility of clearing her name. But more than that, it would mean accepting that the man she'd fallen in love with thought so little of her that he could believe her capable of elaborate deception. It would mean giving up on something that had brought her more happiness than she'd experienced in years. "What are you suggesting?" she asked. "I'm suggesting we find out who's really behind these inquiries. I'm suggesting we prove your innocence and expose whoever is trying to manipulate both of you." Clara looked at her son, seeing determination in his face that reminded her of his father. "And how do you propose we do that?" "By talking to Mr. Brandt, by convincing him to look beyond the surface evidence and consider other possibilities, by fighting for what you've built together instead of walking away from it." Through her window, Clara could see Elwood standing on his porch, his shoulders bowed with what might have been regret. The man who'd confessed his feelings just weeks ago now looked older, lonelier, diminished by the doubts that had poisoned whatever they'd shared. "You're broke, and I'm lonely," Clara whispered, remembering his words from that transformative evening. The confession that had changed everything between them, that had given her hope for a future she'd never dared imagine. Now that future lay in ruins, destroyed by suspicion and doubt. But as Clara looked at the suitcase in her hands and thought about the choice before her flee in wounded pride or stay and fight for the truth, she realized that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. Especially then. Clara sat at her small kitchen table, a piece of stationery before her and a pen trembling in her hand. The resignation letter should have been simply formal notice of her intention to leave her position, effective immediately. But each time she tried to write the words, her hand stilled, and she found herself staring at the blank page as if it held answers she couldn't find. "Dear Mr. Brandt," she'd written, then crossed it out, too formal after everything they'd shared. "Dear Elwood," she'd tried next, but that felt presumptuous now that trust had been broken between them. In the end, she'd settled on Sir, though even that seemed wrong. The words she needed wouldn't come because leaving felt like admitting guilt, like confirming every suspicion that had been whispered in the shadows of their relationship. But staying meant facing Elwood's doubt every day, seeing suspicion in eyes that had once looked at her with warmth and affection. David found her there an hour later, the letter still unfinished, her coffee grown cold in its cup. "Mom?" He settled into the chair across from her, his expression gentle but determined. "We need to talk." "I've made my decision, David. I'm leaving." "No, you're not." His voice carried the quiet authority he used with difficult students. "Not until we get to the bottom of this." Clara looked up from the unfinished letter, seeing her son's face set in stubborn lines that reminded her painfully of his father. "There's nothing to get to the bottom of. Elwood thinks I'm after his money. That's all there is to it." "Is it, Mum? I've been thinking about this situation, and something doesn't add up." David leaned forward, his voice urgent. "You've worked for the Brandt family for 20 years. If you'd wanted information about their finances, you could have gotten it any time. Why would you suddenly start asking questions through outside sources? Maybe he thinks I got greedy. Maybe he thinks his confession of feelings made me realize there was more money to be had than just my wages. Do you hear yourself? You're talking about a man who's known you for 2 decades, who's seen your character, your integrity, your pride. Does that sound like someone who would suddenly believe you capable of elaborate financial scheming?" Clara considered her son's words, remembering the shock in Elwood's eyes when he'd confronted her, the way his voice had shaken with more than anger. There had been hurt there too, and confusion, as if he couldn't reconcile what he'd been told with what he knew of her character. "Then why did he accuse me?" "Because someone wanted him to. Someone who knew exactly how to plant seeds of doubt, who had enough information about your relationship to make the accusations seem credible." Clara set down her pen, giving David her full attention. "You think someone is deliberately trying to break us apart? I think someone saw your growing closeness and decided to put a stop to it. The question is who and why." Before Clara could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. She opened it to find Pete Garrison standing on her doorstep, his weathered face creased with concern. "Mrs. Hutchins," he said, removing his hat. "Heard you might be thinking of leaving us. Hope that's not true." Clara invited him in, noting how Pete's eyes took in the half-packed suitcase, the resignation letter on the table. His expression grew troubled. "Pete, what do you know about these accusations against me?" Clara asked without preamble. Pete's face darkened. "Know enough to know they're horse shit, pardon my language. Anyone who thinks you're after Mr. Brandt's money doesn't know you worth a damn. But someone's been asking questions about his finances, someone with detailed knowledge of his affairs." "Yeah, I heard about that." Pete settled his bulk into Clara's small chair, which creaked under his weight. "Been thinking about it all morning, and I got some ideas about who might be behind it." David and Clara exchanged glances. "What kind of ideas?" "Well, there's been some interest in the ranch lately. Not from potential buyers, but from developers, investors, people who see 10,000 acres of prime land and think about what they could do with it." Clara frowned. "But the ranch isn't for sale." "No, but Mr. Brandt's getting up in years, and he's got no children, no obvious heirs. People have been wondering what'll happen to all this land when he's gone." "What kind of people?" Pete pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket. Got curious after I heard about the private investigator, so I did some asking around. Found out there's been a development company sniffing around, asking questions about property values, water rights, mineral surveys. They've been real interested in the legal status of the ranch, whether there are any debts against it, who might inherit. Clara took the paper, scanning the information Pete had gathered. The company was based in Denver, with backing from investors who specialized in converting ranch land into residential developments. They think they can buy the ranch after Elwood dies, she said, understanding dawning. That's what I figure. Problem is, if Mr. Brandt has someone special in his life, someone who might inherit or influence his decisions about the property, their plans get a lot more complicated. David leaned forward, his mind working. So they decided to eliminate the complication by destroying the relationship. Makes sense to me, Pete said. Hire a private investigator to ask questions about Mr. Brandt's estate. Make sure word gets back to him that someone close to him has been snooping around his finances. Plant suspicion, drive a wedge, problem solved. Clara felt anger building in her chest, hot and righteous. They're using our feelings against us. They're destroying something beautiful for the sake of a business deal. Seems like it. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Clara looked at the resignation letter, at her half-packed suitcase, at the evidence of manipulation spread across her kitchen table. The easy thing would be to leave, to walk away from the pain and complication and start over somewhere else. But the easy thing would also mean letting the manipulators win, letting them destroy not just her relationship with Elwood, but his trust in his own judgment. I'm going to fight, she said quietly. Good, Pete said, standing, because Mr. Brandt's been wandering around that big house like a lost soul since this morning. Man's torn up about what happened, but he's too proud to admit he might have been wrong. After Pete left, Clara and David spent the afternoon planning their approach. They would need evidence, not just theories. They would need to prove that the development company had hired investigators to gather information about the ranch, and that those same investigators had deliberately planted suspicion about Clara's motives. It won't be easy, David warned. These people are professionals. They'll have covered their tracks. Maybe. But they made one mistake. They underestimated how well people around here know me. Pete didn't believe their implications for a second. Others won't either. As the sun set over the ranch, Clara made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of finishing her resignation letter, she tore it up. Instead of completing her packing, she hung her clothes back in the closet. If she was going to fight for the truth, she couldn't do it from a position of retreat. But first, she needed to have a conversation with Elwood that neither of them was ready for. She found him in his office, staring out the window at the darkening sky. He looked older than she'd ever seen him, worn down by doubt and regret, and the weight of accusations he'd never wanted to make. Elwood, she said from the doorway. He turned, hope and wariness warring in his expression. Clara, I thought you'd gone. I should have. Pride would have been easier. She stepped into the room, noting how he tensed at her approach. But I'm not going to let them win. Them? Clara told him about her conversation with Pete, about the development company and their interest in his ranch, about the theory that someone had deliberately set out to destroy their relationship. As she spoke, she watched Elwood's face change, saw understanding replace suspicion, saw shame at his own doubts creep into his eyes. My God, he said when she finished. Clara, you believed what you were told to believe. They counted on that. They counted on you being so shocked by the accusations that you wouldn't look deeper, wouldn't question their source. Elwood sank into his chair, his face in his hands. I should have trusted you. 20 years of knowing your character, and I let a piece of paper make me doubt everything. You're human. You were hurt and confused and looking for explanations. Clara moved closer, close enough to see the anguish in his expression. The question is, what are we going to do about it? He looked up at her, and for the first time since morning, she saw the man she'd fallen in love with, instead of the employer who'd accused her of betrayal. We're going to prove they're behind this. We're going to expose their manipulation and make sure they can't hurt anyone else the way they've hurt us. And then Elwood stood, moving to stand before her. And then I'm going to spend the rest of my life making up for the fact that I doubted the best woman I've ever known. Clara felt her heart skip at the intensity in his voice, at the promise implicit in his words. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. They still had to prove their case, still had to face down the people who'd tried to destroy them. But for the first time since morning, she felt hope stirring in her chest. "Together," she asked. "Together," he confirmed, and reached for her hand. Outside, night settled over the ranch like a blanket, hiding the scars of the day's revelations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But tonight, two people who'd almost lost each other to manipulation and doubt stood together in the lamplight, ready to fight for the truth and for the love that had surprised them both. The war wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. Clara stood before her dresser mirror, her hands shaking as she untied the white apron that had been her uniform for 20 years. The simple piece of fabric represented everything she'd been in this house, the hired help, the woman who cleaned and cooked and remained invisible behind her role. Tonight, she was setting that role aside to stand before Elwood not as his employee, but as a woman who'd found the courage to fight for truth and love. The apron fell to the floor, and Clara smoothed her simple blue dress, the one she wore to church on Sundays. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers, chosen not for work, but for the woman she was beneath the roles she'd played. Her hands moved to her hair, pulling out the pins that kept it in its practical bun, letting the silver-streaked brown waves fall to her shoulders. For the first time in 2 decades, she looked like Clara Mae Hutchins, the woman, not Mrs. Hutchins, the housekeeper. The walk from her apartment to the main house felt like crossing a continent. Each step took her further from the safety of her established position and closer to a conversation that would change everything between them. The kitchen door, which she'd used thousands of times as the help, seemed wrong tonight. Instead, she walked to the front door and knocked like a visitor, like an equal. Elwood answered, his face registering surprise at seeing her at the formal entrance, at seeing her with her hair down and her apron gone. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, and Clara saw her own nervousness reflected in his eyes. Clara. Her name on his lips sounded different, weighted with recognition of what this moment meant. "May I come in? I think it's time we had an honest conversation." He stepped aside, and she entered through the front door for the first time in 20 years, seeing the house from a new perspective. The formal parlor where she'd dusted but never sat, the grand staircase she'd cleaned but never climbed as anything other than a servant. "We should talk in the parlor," she said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "The parlor?" Elwood looked confused. "We always talk in the kitchen. We've always talked as employer and employee. Tonight, I want to talk as equals." Understanding dawned in his face, and he nodded, leading her to the formal sitting room with its velvet furniture and crystal lamps. Clara chose a chair across from his, her posture straight, her hands folded in her lap. "I need to say something," she began, "and I need you to hear me completely before you respond." Elwood nodded, settling into his chair, but leaning forward attentively. "This morning, when you accused me of being after your money, it broke something in me. Not just my heart, though that's true too. It broke my faith in my own judgment, in my ability to read people's character." Clara's voice was calm, measured, but Elwood could see the emotion beneath the surface. "For 20 years, I believed I knew you. I believed you were a man of honor, of kindness, of fairness. When you looked at me with suspicion in your eyes, when you believed I could scheme and manipulate for financial gain, I thought I'd been wrong about everything." Elwood started to speak, but Clara held up a hand. "Let me finish. I almost left. I packed my things, wrote a resignation letter, prepared to disappear from your life, rather than face the daily reminder that the man I'd grown to love thought so little of me." She paused, gathering strength. "But then I realized something. Running away wouldn't prove my innocence, it would confirm your doubts. More than that, it would let whoever is behind this manipulation win." "Clara, I'm not finished." Her voice carried steel now, the strength that had carried her through widowhood and poverty and 20 years of dignified service. I realized that if I truly love you, and I do, Elwood, more than I ever thought possible then, I owe it to both of us to fight for the truth. I owe it to what we've built together to stand up and demand that you see me clearly. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the ranch lands that had become her world. So here's my truth. I am not after your money. I have never asked you for anything beyond my wages. I have never snooped through your papers or pried into your financial affairs. The feelings I've developed for you have nothing to do with what you own and everything to do with who you are. Turning back to face him, Clara's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But if you can't see that, if 20 years of knowing me isn't enough to make you trust in my character, then we have nothing to build on. Elwood stood slowly, his face a map of anguish and regret. Clara, I'm not done. She moved closer to him, close enough to see the pain in his eyes. I need to know something, and I need complete honesty. When you accused me this morning, was it because the evidence was so compelling you couldn't ignore it? Or was it because some part of you always wondered if a woman like me could truly care for a man like you without ulterior motives? The question hung between them like a blade. Elwood's face went pale as he recognized the deeper truth she was asking him to confront, not just whether he believed she was guilty of this specific accusation, but whether he'd ever truly believed himself worthy of genuine love. He stopped, the words catching in his throat. Clara, I've been alone for so long. When Margaret died, I convinced myself it was because I wasn't meant for happiness, wasn't the kind of man who inspired deep love. When you began to matter to me, when I started hoping. His voice broke, and Clara saw the vulnerability he'd hidden beneath his wealth and position, the deep-seated fear that he was fundamentally unlovable. You were afraid, she said softly. Afraid that if someone like me could care for you, it had to be for reasons other than love. Elwood nodded, unable to meet her eyes. I'm a rich old man, Clara. What else could you see in me? The raw honesty in his voice broke Clara's heart and filled it simultaneously. This proud, powerful man had spent 15 years believing himself incapable of inspiring genuine affection, and her growing feelings for him had seemed too good to be true. Look at me, she said gently. When he raised his eyes to hers, Clara stepped closer, close enough to touch his face with gentle fingers. I see a man who's been kind to me for 20 years, without expecting anything in return. I see someone who noticed when I was cold and made sure I was warm. I see a person who helped my family when they were in crisis, not for my sake, but because it was the right thing to do. Her voice grew stronger with each word. I see a man worth loving, Elwood. Not because of what you own, but because of who you are. Tears gathered in Elwood's eyes as he heard the words he'd never believed he deserved. Clara. And if you can't see that in yourself, if you can't trust that someone might love you simply for being you, then we need to work on that together. But I won't be punished for caring about you. I won't apologize for seeing your worth when you can't see it yourself. Elwood reached for Clara's hands, holding them as if they were precious things he'd almost lost forever. You're right, about all of it. I was afraid, terrified that what I felt was real, but what you felt was obligation, or gratitude, or strategy. Clara squeezed his hands gently. And now I see what a fool I've been. Not just about you, but about myself. Elwood's voice grew stronger as he spoke. I've spent 15 years believing I wasn't worth loving, and when love found me anyway, I couldn't trust it was real. What changed? Elwood smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him all day. You did, standing here, fighting for us instead of running away, demanding that I see you clearly, see us clearly. Clara, if you were after my money, you would have disappeared the moment accusations were made. You certainly wouldn't be here, challenging me to be better than my fears. Clara felt tears she'd been holding back all day finally beginning to fall. I couldn't leave, not without fighting for what we have. It means too much to me. What do we have? Elwood asked softly. I need to hear you say it. Clara looked into his eyes. seeing not her employer but the man who'd become essential to her happiness. We have love, real, honest, complicated, wonderful love. We have 20 years of shared mornings and quiet evenings and small kindnesses that grew into something bigger than either of us expected. Despite the differences between us, despite what people will say. Because of what people will say, Clara's voice was fierce now. Because choosing love despite obstacles is braver than choosing safety despite loneliness. Because what we feel for each other is worth fighting for. Elwood released her hands and walked to the kitchen, returning with 2 simple ceramic cups filled with coffee. "Sit with me," he said, settling onto the formal sofa. Not as employer and employee, but as 2 people trying to figure out how to build something real together. Clara accepted the cup, noting the symbolism of sharing coffee in the formal parlor instead of the kitchen. They were equals now, partners in whatever came next. "The development company," Elwood said. "Pete's theory makes sense. They saw our growing closeness as a threat to their plans for the ranch. Can we prove it?" "We can try. James Hartwell is already investigating the source of the inquiries about my estate. If they're connected to outside interests, he'll find the trail." Clara sipped her coffee, thinking, even if we prove they manipulated the situation, there's still the matter of what happens next. Between us, I mean. Elwood set down his cup and turned to face her fully. "What do you want to happen next?" The question hung between them, loaded with possibility and risk. Clara had spent the day fighting for the right to have this conversation. But now that the moment had arrived, the magnitude of what they were discussing overwhelmed her. "I want to be with you," she said simply, "not as your housekeeper who happens to live nearby, but as your partner, your equal, someone who shares your life because we choose to share it. The town will talk. Let them talk. People always find something to gossip about. At least this time it'll be true." Elwood's smile widened. "So we're really doing this. We're going to scandalize half of Wyoming by proving that love doesn't respect social boundaries. We're going to live honestly for the first time in years, both of us." Clara reached for his hand again. "But Elwood, I need you to understand something. I won't be your kept woman. I won't live in your house as some kind of mistress while you maintain respectability. If we do this, we do it properly." "What are you saying?" Clara took a deep breath, feeling as though she was stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. "I'm saying that if you want me in your life, you'll have to marry me. Not because it's expected, but because I deserve the respect and commitment that comes with being your wife, not your convenience." The words hung in the air between them, a challenge and an invitation wrapped together. Elwood stared at her, seeing not just the woman who'd cared for his house, but the woman who'd just demanded he recognize her worth, who'd fought for their relationship when he'd been too afraid to defend it himself. "Clara Mae Hutchins," he said slowly, "are you proposing to me? I'm telling you what I need to be happy. The rest is up to you." Elwood stood and walked to the mantelpiece, where a small wooden box sat among family photographs. Clara watched as he opened it and removed something small and gold, a ring that caught the lamplight like captured fire. "This was my grandmother's ring," he said, returning to sit beside her. "I've been carrying it around for 3 weeks, trying to work up the courage to ask you to marry me." Clara's breath caught as he held up the simple gold band, set with a modest diamond. "You have?" "I've been planning to propose since Christmas. I was just waiting for the right moment, the right words, the right," he laughed softly, "the right courage, I suppose. And now," Elwood took her left hand in his, looking into her eyes with love and certainty, "now I know that the right words are simple ones. Clara, I love you. I want to spend whatever years I have left loving you properly, openly, with the whole world knowing you're mine and I'm yours. Will you marry me?" Clara looked at the ring, at this man who'd found the courage to offer her everything, despite the obstacles they faced. "Yes," she whispered, then stronger. "Yes, I'll marry you." As Elwood slipped his grandmother's ring onto her finger, Clara felt the last walls between them crumble. They were no longer employer and employee, no longer the rich man and the poor woman, no longer separated by the social expectations that had kept them apart for so long. They were simply two people who'd found love in an unexpected place and chosen to fight for it, despite every reason they'd been given to let it go. 6 months later, the photograph on the mantelpiece told a story of transformation that would have seemed impossible the previous winter. Where once a single image of Margaret Brandt had presided over the formal parlor, now a new family portrait claimed the place of honor Elwood and Clara on their wedding day, flanked by David and his family, all of them smiling with the joy of connections restored and love acknowledged. Clara stood in the kitchen of what was now truly her home, humming Amazing Grace while she prepared breakfast for her husband of 4 months. The word still felt new on her tongue, still sent a flutter of happiness through her chest. Mrs. Clara Brandt, her name, she'd never expected to wear but had grown into with surprising grace. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the modest diamond on her left hand, the simple gold band that had belonged to Elwood's grandmother. Clara had insisted on keeping it simple when they could have afforded something grander. What mattered wasn't the size of the stone, but the commitment it represented, the promise two people had made to choose love over fear, honesty over convention. "Good morning, wife," Elwood said, entering the kitchen and wrapping his arms around her from behind. At 69, he moved with the contentment of a man who'd finally found his place in the world. "Good morning, husband." Clara leaned back against him, still marveling at how natural the intimacy felt. How right it was to have this kind of closeness after years of careful distance. Their wedding had been the talk of 3 counties, just as they'd expected. Some folks had clucked their tongues and whispered about propriety, but more had smiled and nodded their approval. Pete Garrison had served as best man, declaring it the best decision Elwood had ever made, aside from hiring Clara in the first place. The pastor had performed the ceremony with tears in his eyes, having watched both of them carry their loneliness too long. Clara had worn her mother's wedding dress, altered and updated, but carrying the love of generations. Elwood had worn his best suit and a smile that hadn't left his face for weeks. When they'd exchanged vows in the small church where Clara had worshipped for 20 years, there hadn't been a dry eye in the congregation. The investigation into the development company had borne fruit exactly as Pete had predicted. James Hartwell had traced the suspicious inquiries back to a Denver firm that specialized in acquiring ranch land for residential development. They'd hired a private investigator to gather information about the Brandt estate, hoping to position themselves as buyers when Elwood eventually died. Clara's growing importance in his life had threatened their plans, so they'd attempted to eliminate her influence through manufactured suspicion. The scheme had backfired spectacularly. Not only had it failed to drive Clara away, but it had also prompted Elwood to review and update his estate planning in ways that would make the ranch much more difficult for outside developers to acquire. Clara was now his primary beneficiary, with provisions to ensure the land would remain a working ranch rather than becoming subdivided into housing developments. "David called last night," Clara said, turning in Elwood's arms. "Sarah's doing wonderfully with her hearing. She made the honor roll again." "Good for her. When are they visiting next?" "Summer vacation. 2 whole weeks." Clara's face lit up with anticipation. In the months since their marriage, David had become not just accepting, but genuinely fond of his new stepfather. Linda had confided that she'd never seen Clara so happy, and the children adored their new grandfather, who sent them books and toys and long letters about ranch life. "I'll take Michael fishing," Elwood said. "Pete's been asking when he could teach someone proper casting technique." The transformation in Elwood had been remarkable to witness. Marriage had given him not just a wife but a family, connections that extended beyond the ranch to include people who cared about him for reasons that had nothing to do with his wealth or position. He'd started smiling more, laughing more, engaging with the community in ways he hadn't since Margaret's death. Clara, too, had blossomed in ways that surprised everyone who knew her. No longer confined to the role of housekeeper, she'd thrown herself into being a rancher's wife with enthusiasm that infected everyone around her. She'd joined the church board, started a reading group for the town's women, and become Elwood's full partner in managing the ranch's affairs. The house itself had changed, filled now with laughter and conversation, and the kind of warmth that comes from being truly lived in rather than simply maintained. Clara had redecorated with touches that reflected both their personalities' family photographs alongside ranch awards, her mother's quilt draped over the sofa in the formal parlor that had become their evening retreat. Most evenings found them there together, sharing coffee and conversation about the day's events, planning for the future, simply enjoying the companionship they discovered in each other. Sometimes they talked about the ranch, sometimes about David's family, sometimes about nothing more significant than the weather or the book one of them was reading. But whatever they talked about, they talked as equals, as partners, as two people who'd found in each other the missing piece of themselves they hadn't even known they were looking for. "Do you ever regret it?" Elwood asked, as they sat down to breakfast at the table that was no longer set for one. "Giving up your independence to tie yourself to an old rancher?" Clara looked at him across the table, this man who'd become her anchor and her adventure both. "Do you ever regret admitting you were broke and lonely?" "Never." His answer was immediate and certain. "Best confession I ever made." "Then you have my answer too." Clara reached across the table to touch his hand, her wedding ring catching the morning light. "I was broke in ways that had nothing to do with money, and lonely in ways I didn't even recognize until I wasn't anymore." Outside, the Wyoming sun climbed higher over land that stretched toward horizons they would explore together. The cattle grazed peacefully in pastures that would pass to future generations. The ranch hands went about their work with the contentment of men employed by fair and generous people, and the house that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with the sounds of a life fully lived. Sometimes the richest man in the county really was the luckiest man alive. And sometimes the woman who'd spent 20 years cleaning his house discovered she'd been building a home all along, one relationship at a time, one shared morning at a time, one small act of love that grew into something magnificent enough to transform two lives completely. In the end, that was wealth beyond measure.